Wicked wife humiliated her crippled husband before the maid. Then karma hit brutally. Vincent Hayes had once been Atlanta's real estate king with $50 million in assets. But after the accident that left him wheelchair-bound, his wife Natasha had completely changed. She didn't just humiliate Vincent in front of their housekeeper Keisha, she openly despised his weakness, treating him like a stranger in his own home. Vincent felt like he was drowning in his own living room, watching the woman he'd married transform into someone who saw him as nothing more than a burden to endure. But Natasha had no idea that her husband had been quietly collecting evidence of her betrayal with each passing day. And when the truth was finally exposed, the consequences would be more brutal than anything she had ever imagined. If you want to see how this story of betrayal and justice unfolds, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Hit like if you believe karma always finds a way, and let us know in the comments. Have you ever witnessed someone get the comeuppance they deserved? Now let's see what Vincent discovers about his wife's true nature. Vincent Hayes stared through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Buckhead mansion, watching the morning sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn that he could no longer walk. 8 months ago, he had been the undisputed king of Atlanta real estate, closing multi-million-dollar deals from his penthouse office, while commanding respect from every developer in the Southeast. Now he sat in a wheelchair, his once powerful legs motionless beneath a cashmere blanket, reduced to a spectator in his own life. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had built an empire of luxury homes only to become a prisoner in his own. The sound of heels clicking against marble floors announced Natasha's entrance before she appeared. His wife of 4 years swept into the living room, wearing a designer dress that cost more than most people's monthly salary, her dark skin glowing with the kind of radiance that came from expensive spa treatments and zero concern for anyone else's suffering. She had been beautiful when they met, stunning actually, but something fundamental had shifted in her expression since his accident. Where warmth once lived, cold calculation had taken residence. "Vincent, we need to discuss the household staff situation," she announced without preamble, not bothering to make eye contact as she scrolled through her phone. Before Vincent could respond, Keisha Williams emerged from the kitchen carrying a silver tray with his morning coffee. The 28-year-old housekeeper moved with quiet dignity, her presence somehow managing to bring warmth into rooms that Natasha's coldness had frozen. Keisha had been working for them for 6 months now, hired after Vincent's accident when they needed someone reliable to help with his care. Unlike the parade of nurses who had come and gone, treating him like a medical case study, Keisha saw him as a human being. She set the coffee within easy reach of his wheelchair and offered a small smile that held genuine kindness, something increasingly rare in his world. "Actually, Keisha, since you're here," Natasha said, her voice taking on the particular tone she used when she wanted to inflict maximum damage, "I think it's time we all acknowledge the reality of our situation. My husband isn't the man he used to be. He's not capable of making decisions anymore. Not capable of running a business. Frankly, not capable of much of anything." The words hit Vincent like physical blows, each syllable carefully chosen to strip away another layer of his dignity. Keisha's face tightened with barely concealed anger, but she remained silent, understanding that her job and her ability to support her 5-year-old daughter hung in the balance. Vincent felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had been his constant companion since realizing that his accident had given Natasha permission to reveal her true nature. "Mrs. Hayes," Keisha said carefully, her voice steady despite the obvious discomfort, "Mr. Hayes has been working on his physical therapy every day." The doctors said, but Natasha cut her off with a dismissive wave that made it clear she had no interest in hope or recovery or anything that might contradict her narrative. "The doctors say a lot of things, Keisha. What matters is what we can see with our own eyes. And what I see is a man who can't even get himself dressed in the morning without help." Vincent's hands clenched into fists on his wheelchair's armrests, his jaw tight with the effort of staying silent. He had learned that fighting back only gave Natasha more ammunition, more opportunities to paint him as unstable or delusional. The conversation was interrupted by the soft chime of Natasha's phone. She glanced at the screen and her entire demeanor shifted. Her posture straightened, her expression softened, and something that might have been excitement flickered in her eyes. "I need to take this call," she said, already moving toward the hallway, her voice dropping to the conspiratorial whisper she reserved for conversations she didn't want overheard. Vincent watched her go, noting the way she glanced back at him before disappearing around the corner, as if making sure he hadn't somehow developed the ability to follow her. These mysterious phone calls had become increasingly frequent over the past few weeks, always accompanied by the same secretive behavior. Keisha busied herself straightening magazines on the coffee table, but Vincent could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her movements had become sharp and purposeful in the aftermath of Natasha's verbal assault. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "Mr. Hayes, I want you to know that I don't agree with what she said. You're not broken, and you're not useless. I've seen you working on those financial reports. I've seen how your mind works. That accident didn't touch the parts of you that matter most." Her words were a lifeline thrown to a drowning man, and Vincent felt something inside his chest unclenched for the first time in hours. But even as gratitude washed over him, he couldn't shake the feeling that Natasha's behavior was building towards something bigger, something that would make her daily humiliations seem gentle by comparison. But Vincent didn't know that those mysterious phone calls were just the beginning of a plan that had been months in the making, a plan that would soon threaten everything he had left to lose. The morning after Natasha's latest humiliation, Keisha arrived at the Hayes mansion with a determination that Vincent hadn't seen before. She moved through the house with purpose, bringing him coffee without being asked and positioning herself strategically near the living room where he spent most of his days. When Natasha left for one of her mysterious appointments, claiming she would be shopping with girlfriends, Keisha finally spoke the words that had been building inside her for weeks. "Mr. Hayes, what she's doing to you isn't right. I've worked for a lot of families, and I've never seen a wife treat her husband like that." Her voice carried the weight of someone who had witnessed too much cruelty to stay silent any longer. Vincent looked up from the financial reports he'd been reviewing, surprised by the directness of her statement. In his world of corporate boardrooms and carefully measured conversations, such honest emotion was rare. "Keisha, I appreciate that, but you don't need to get involved in our marriage problems. I know you need this job." The concern in his voice was genuine. He'd learned enough about her situation to know that losing her position would be devastating. She was a single mother raising a 5-year-old daughter named Mia, working multiple jobs to keep their heads above water. The Hayes family paid well enough that this job had allowed her to quit her night shift at a local diner, giving her the chance to actually be home when her daughter went to sleep. "That's exactly why I need to get involved," Keisha said, settling into the chair across from him with the kind of resolve that Vincent recognized from his business dealings with people who had made up their minds. "My daughter asks me every day what I did at work, and I want to be able to tell her I stood up for what's right. Besides," she added with a slight smile, "you've been nothing but respectful to me since I started here. You ask about Mia, you remember her birthday, you even helped me figure out that tax problem last month. That's not the behavior of someone who's lost his mind or his worth." Vincent felt something shift in his chest. Not pity, which had become his constant companion, but something warmer and more substantial. Here was someone who saw him as a person rather than a problem to be managed. Over the following days, their conversations became longer and more meaningful. Keisha would bring his lunch and stay to chat about everything from her daughter's kindergarten adventures to Vincent's memories of building his real estate empire from nothing. She had grown up in East Atlanta, working since she was 16 to help support her family, and there was a strength in her that reminded Vincent of his younger self, hungry, determined, unwilling to accept limitations that others tried to impose. "You know what I think?" she said one afternoon while helping him with his physical therapy exercises. "I think your wife is scared that you're going to get better. She's gotten comfortable treating you like you're helpless. But what happens to her attitude when you prove you're not?" The observation hit Vincent like a revelation, mainly because it aligned with something he'd been noticing but hadn't fully articulated. Since his accident, he'd been using his laptop to stay connected to his business through video calls and email, maintaining relationships with key clients and keeping tabs on major deals. His mind remained as sharp as ever, his understanding of market trends and investment opportunities unchanged by his physical limitations. Yet Natasha consistently dismissed any mention of his continued involvement in business, as if his wheelchair had somehow erased decades of expertise and success. She seemed invested in the narrative of his incompetence, almost protective of it when anyone suggested otherwise. "There's something else," Keisha said, lowering her voice and glancing toward the hallway to make sure they were alone. "I've been noticing things about Mrs. Hayes that don't add up. She gets dressed up for these shopping trips with her girlfriends, but she never comes home with shopping bags. And yesterday, when I was cleaning the study, I heard her on the phone with someone talking about paperwork and timelines." Vincent's attention sharpened, his business instincts, dormant for months, suddenly awakening. Keisha continued, "She was saying something about making sure everything was properly documented and that timing was crucial. It didn't sound like girl talk to me." Vincent made a mental note to check the security camera footage from the past few weeks. He still had administrative access to the home security system, something Natasha had overlooked in her assumption that he was no longer capable of managing such details. The house was equipped with cameras in all common areas, installed years ago when they'd had problems with contractors stealing during renovations. If Natasha was conducting business calls at home, there would be a record of when and where those conversations took place. The thought of investigating his own wife left a bitter taste in his mouth, but Keisha's observations had awakened a suspicion that he could no longer ignore. "Keisha," he said carefully, "if you notice anything else unusual, would you let me know? Not because I want to spy on my wife, but because I'm starting to think there's more going on here than just her struggling to cope with my condition." She nodded with the seriousness of someone who understood that they were crossing into dangerous territory. They were no longer just employer and employee having friendly conversations. They were allies in an investigation that could change everything. Vincent felt the first stirring of hope he'd experienced since his accident. Not hope for physical recovery, but hope that he might still have some control over his fate. What Keisha didn't realize was that the girlfriend she'd been hearing Natasha talk to had a distinctly masculine voice, and those conversations were about to become much more dangerous. Vincent waited until Natasha left for another mysterious appointment before accessing the security system from his laptop. The familiar interface brought back memories of when he'd overseen every detail of their home's construction, including the state-of-the-art surveillance network he'd insisted on installing. Now those same cameras would reveal truths he'd never wanted to discover. The timestamp showed Natasha leaving at 2:15 on Tuesday afternoon, claiming that she was meeting her college friend Rebecca for lunch and shopping. Vincent fast-forwarded through the external camera feeds, tracking her silver Mercedes as it left their Buckhead neighborhood and headed downtown toward what should have been an innocent afternoon with girlfriends. What he found made his blood run cold. Instead of the upscale shopping district, Natasha had driven to a small coffee shop in Virginia Highland. Vincent zoomed in on the footage, his heart hammering as he watched his wife walk directly to a corner table where a man was already waiting. The stranger was tall, well-dressed, with the confident posture Vincent recognized from years of business dealings. Someone accustomed to being in control. The next few minutes of footage destroyed whatever remained of Vincent's faith in his marriage. Natasha leaned across the table, her body language flirtatious in a way he hadn't seen directed at him in months. The man reached for her hand, stroking her fingers while she laughed. Then came the moment that would replay in Vincent's mind for hours. Natasha glanced around to ensure privacy, then leaned forward and kissed the stranger with an intensity that spoke of deep familiarity and shared secrets. Vincent spent the next hour methodically reviewing security footage from the past month, documenting every instance of Natasha's unexplained absences. The pattern was damning. She met with the same man at least twice weekly, always at different locations, always during times when she'd claimed innocent social activities. He took screenshots of the clearest images, building a file that would serve as undeniable proof. The man's expensive suit and confident demeanor suggested he was a professional, and their conversations appeared too intense for casual romance. This wasn't just adultery. This felt like business meetings disguised as romantic encounters. When Natasha returned that evening, she carried shopping bags from stores she'd never visited, receipts for purchases, the timestamps proved she couldn't have made. Vincent watched her perform the charade of showing him a new scarf and jewelry, her voice bright with false enthusiasm as she described her wonderful day with Rebecca. "We had such a good time catching up," she said, hanging the scarf with theatrical care. "You know how it is with old friends. You lose track of time just talking." Vincent nodded and smiled, playing the trusting husband while fury burned in his chest. The ease with which she lied was almost as devastating as the affair itself. The next morning brought a new level of cruelty that left Vincent questioning everything he thought he knew about the woman he'd married. Keisha had arrived early to help with his morning routine when Natasha descended the stairs like a queen holding court. Natasha poured herself a glass of ice water, her movements deliberate and calculating as she positioned herself near Vincent's wheelchair. "Keisha," Natasha called out, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant trouble. "I think it's important that you understand the reality of what you're dealing with here." Vincent sensed something significant was about to happen. Natasha held the glass above Vincent's head, her posture commanding, an expression cold. "My husband isn't the man he used to be. Frankly, he's not much of a man at all anymore." Without warning, she tilted the glass and poured the cold water directly onto Vincent's head and shoulders, the liquid soaking through his shirt as he sat helpless in his wheelchair. Keisha gasped in shock, her cleaning supplies clattering to the floor. Keisha's reaction was immediate and fierce. "Mrs. Hayes, I don't think that's appropriate to say, especially not in front of—" Natasha cut her off with a laugh that held no warmth. "Appropriate? Keisha, you work in this house every day. You see how helpless he is, how dependent, how diminished. I'm not saying anything that isn't obvious to anyone with eyes." Vincent gripped his wheelchair's armrests until his knuckles went white, fighting the urge to defend himself. Water dripped from his hair onto his lap as he struggled to maintain composure, the cold shock of humiliation cutting deeper than any physical discomfort. Something told him to wait, to listen, to let Natasha reveal more of her true nature. "Mr. Hayes is one of the strongest people I've ever met," Keisha said, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger. She immediately moved toward Vincent with a kitchen towel, gently helping to dry his face and shoulders while shooting daggers at Natasha with her eyes. "What happened to his legs doesn't change that. The way you're talking about him, your own husband, it's just wrong." Natasha's expression hardened into something Vincent had never seen before, a mask slipping away to reveal cold calculation underneath. "You're paid to clean this house and help with his care, not offer commentary on my marriage. If you can't handle the reality of the situation, perhaps you should look for employment elsewhere." The threat hung in the air like poison, and Vincent realized his wife wasn't just cruel, she was strategic about it. Vincent made a decision that would change everything. As soon as Natasha left for another appointment, he called James Parker, a private investigator he'd worked with during complicated business deals years earlier. James had always been thorough, discreet, and ruthless when it came to uncovering truth. "Vincent Hayes," James said warmly, "I heard about your accident. How are you holding up?" Vincent explained Natasha's behavior, the mysterious man, and his growing suspicion that something much bigger than adultery was at play. "Send me everything you view," James said after listening to the whole story. "Photos, timestamps, any documentation of her behavior or statements." "Vincent, the way you're describing this situation, the timing, the calculated cruelty, the systematic isolation, it sounds like someone building a case for something. I've seen this pattern before in divorce proceedings where one spouse is trying to establish that the other is incompetent or unstable." James's investigation was about to uncover something that would make simple adultery look like a mercy. David Rodriguez specialized in destroying disabled husbands, and Vincent was his next target. James Parker's investigation moved with the efficiency that had made him Vincent's trusted ally during the most complex business deals. Within 72 hours of taking the case, James had uncovered a web of deception that stretched back far longer than Vincent's accident. The private investigator arrived at the Hayes mansion on a gray Tuesday morning, his expression grim as he spread phone records across Vincent's mahogany desk like evidence in a murder trial. "Vincent, this goes deeper than we thought," James said, his finger tracing a pattern of calls that painted a devastating picture. "Natasha has been in contact with David Rodriguez for over a year, 3 months before your accident even happened. The phone records revealed a systematic courtship that had nothing to do with romance. The frequency of calls between Natasha and Rodriguez had increased steadily in the weeks leading up to Vincent's accident, with conversations lasting 30 to 40 minutes each. These aren't the patterns of an affair, James explained, highlighting specific dates and times. These are business meetings disguised as personal calls. Rodriguez was coaching her, preparing her for what was coming. Vincent stared at the documentation, realizing that while he had been focused on expanding his real estate empire, his wife had been planning its systematic destruction with the help of a man who specialized in exactly this kind of calculated betrayal. James had done extensive research into Rodriguez's background, uncovering a pattern of cases that made Vincent's situation feel terrifyingly familiar. David Rodriguez doesn't just practice divorce law, James said, sliding a folder across the desk. He targets wealthy men who become vulnerable due to illness, injury, or age. His success rate in stripping assets from incapacitated husbands is nearly perfect because he's refined the process into an art form. The folder contained newspaper clippings, court records, and financial documents showing Rodriguez's previous victims, successful businessmen who had lost everything to wives they trusted, all of them left with nothing while their ex-spouses lived comfortably on stolen fortunes. The next revelation hit Vincent like a physical blow. Financial records showed that Natasha had been systematically looting their accounts during the months Vincent spent fighting for his life in rehabilitation facilities. She's transferred $15 million into accounts that Rodriguez helped her establish, James said, pointing to a series of transactions that had occurred while Vincent was unconscious or heavily medicated. The timing is surgical. Every major transfer happened when you were unable to monitor your finances. She literally robbed you while you were learning to speak again. Vincent felt nausea rising as he realized the scope of her betrayal. She had used his suffering as cover for theft. That afternoon brought the delivery that James had been dreading, divorce papers that Vincent had never requested and never seen coming. The documents arrived by registered mail, filled with legal language that painted Vincent as mentally unstable and financially incompetent due to severe cognitive impairment resulting from traumatic brain injury. The medical claims were fabricated but expertly crafted, describing symptoms that Vincent had never exhibited and referencing evaluations that had never taken place. She's requesting complete control of marital assets based on your alleged inability to make rational decisions, James explained as Vincent read through the papers with growing horror. This isn't a divorce, it's a complete financial assassination. The escalation to level 3 became clear when James revealed the most sinister aspect of their plan. Rodriguez and Natasha had developed a two-pronged strategy for Vincent's complete destruction. If the divorce proceedings didn't strip him of everything, they had a backup plan that would make legal theft unnecessary. They've been consulting with Dr. Margaret Hoffman, a psychiatrist who specializes in competency evaluations that favor wealthy clients, James said. The plan is to have you declared mentally unfit and committed to a long-term psychiatric facility. Once you're institutionalized, Natasha gains complete control of your estate without the messiness of divorce proceedings. Vincent's blood chilled as James continued explaining the depth of their conspiracy. I've traced 3 other cases where Rodriguez used this exact playbook. Wealthy men who suffered accidents or illnesses, wives who suddenly became concerned about their husband's mental state, and psychiatrists who found exactly the problems they were paid to find. All 3 men are still locked away in expensive facilities, heavily medicated and legally powerless, while their wives live very comfortably on money that was stolen from them. Vincent realized that his wheelchair wasn't just a symbol of his physical limitations. It was a weapon that Rodriguez and Natasha planned to use to take everything he had ever worked for. Later that evening, as Vincent sat alone in his study processing the magnitude of the threat he faced, Keisha appeared in the doorway with her phone in hand and an expression that mixed determination with fear. "Mr. Hayes," she said quietly, "I need to show you something." Mrs. Hayes had a phone call about an hour ago and I recorded it. Vincent's attention snapped to full alertness as Keisha explained that she had been cleaning nearby when Natasha received a call from Rodriguez, discussing what sounded like final preparations for something they called the transition. The recording quality was surprisingly clear, capturing Natasha's side of a conversation that revealed the true depths of her contempt for the man she had married. "David, you have to understand," Natasha's voice said from the phone speaker. "I never married him for love. Vincent was always just a means to an end, a successful man with enough money to set me up for life. The accident was just an opportunity I couldn't waste. Vincent felt something cold and hard crystallize in his chest as he listened to his wife dismiss not just their marriage, but his entire worth as a human being. The casual cruelty in her voice was absolute, as if she had never seen him as anything more than a convenient source of wealth. The conversation continued with Natasha expressing impatience about the timeline and her eagerness to complete what she called the final phase. Rodriguez's voice was audible enough in the background for Vincent to catch fragments about medication schedules and evaluation procedures. Once he's committed, we can complete the asset transfers without any oversight, Natasha said with satisfaction. The facility will keep him sedated and compliant, and I'll finally be free to live the life I deserve. Vincent understood that this wasn't just about money, it was about making him disappear entirely from his own existence. The 48-hour countdown had begun, and Vincent realized that everything he had built in his entire life would be decided by how well he could turn the tables on people who had already proven that they would stop at nothing to destroy him. Vincent's phone buzzed at 6 a.m. with a text that made his blood freeze, a calendar reminder that Natasha had scheduled his psychological evaluation for Friday at 2 p.m., just 48 hours away. The appointment had been made without his knowledge or consent, listed in their shared calendar as V Mental Health Assessment, Dr. Patricia Wells. Vincent understood immediately that this wasn't a suggestion or a medical recommendation. This was the execution date for a plan that had been months in the making. Rodriguez and Natasha had moved from subtle manipulation to open warfare, and Vincent was running out of time to defend himself. The escalation became terrifyingly clear when Natasha began what she called his enhanced wellness routine. Every morning she personally delivered a selection of pills that she claimed were vitamins and supplements recommended by his doctors. "These will help with your energy and mood," she said with false concern, watching carefully to ensure he swallowed each one. Within an hour of taking the medication, Vincent felt his mind becoming clouded with an unfamiliar fog that made concentration nearly impossible. His normally sharp business instincts became sluggish, his ability to follow complex thoughts compromised by what he now recognized as deliberate chemical sedation. Vincent realized with growing horror that Natasha was systematically creating the symptoms that would support Dr. Wells's evaluation. The medication made him appear confused, lethargic, and emotionally unstable, exactly the profile of someone who couldn't be trusted with financial decisions. When James Parker called to discuss their investigation, Vincent found himself struggling to follow the conversation, his words slurring slightly as he tried to process information that should have been simple. "Vincent, you sound different," James said with obvious concern. "Are you taking any new medications?" The question confirmed what Vincent already suspected. He was being poisoned in slow motion. The next morning brought a decision that would either save his life or destroy it completely. Instead of swallowing the pills Natasha provided, Vincent palmed them with practiced sleight of hand, later disposing of them in the toilet while she wasn't watching. The food was harder to avoid without arousing suspicion, so he began eating less, claiming the medication was affecting his appetite. When Natasha pressed him to eat more, he played the role of a confused invalid, mumbling about feeling too tired to finish his meals. The performance was necessary, but every moment of pretending to be diminished felt like another small death. James Parker's investigation had revealed the true scope of the threat Vincent faced. "They're not just planning to take your money," James explained during a hurried phone call while Natasha was out. "Rodriguez specializes in having wealthy disabled men committed to long-term psychiatric facilities. Once you're institutionalized, Natasha gains complete control of your estate. The facility gets paid handsomely for keeping you sedated and compliant, and you disappear from your own life forever." Vincent felt his chest tighten as James continued. "I've found 3 other cases where Rodriguez used this exact playbook. All 3 men are still locked away, and their wives are living very comfortably on their money." Vincent knew that his only chance was to beat them at their own game, but first he needed legal firepower that could match Rodriguez's expertise. Elizabeth Stone had built her reputation defending estates against exactly this kind of predatory behavior, and when Vincent called her, her response was immediate and reassuring. "I've been waiting for someone to finally challenge Rodriguez's operation. she said with barely contained anger. What he's doing is elder abuse on an industrial scale, but he's careful to stay within legal boundaries. We need to catch him making a mistake, something that proves intent to defraud rather than genuine concern for your welfare. The trap Vincent set was elegant in its simplicity. When Rodriguez visited the house again, this time with paperwork for Vincent to sign, Vincent allowed the lingering effects of the morning's medication to show, while secretly recording the conversation on his phone. Rodriguez presented documents that would grant Natasha power of attorney and authorize his immediate admission to a specialized care facility that would better serve his needs. Vincent pretended to consider the offer, asking confused questions that Rodriguez answered with increasing boldness. Think of it as a vacation from all these stressful decisions, Rodriguez said with practiced sympathy. You'll be much happier when you don't have to worry about things that are clearly beyond your current capabilities. Keisha had positioned herself in the hallway where she could overhear the conversation, and when Rodriguez left, she approached Vincent with fury blazing in her eyes. I heard what he said about you needing to be managed like a child, she said, her voice shaking with indignation. Mr. Hayes, that man isn't trying to help you. He's trying to make you disappear. Vincent showed her the recording he'd made, and together they listened to Rodriguez's casual dismissal of Vincent's intelligence and autonomy. The attorney's arrogance had led him to be remarkably candid about his intentions, providing exactly the kind of evidence Elizabeth Stone would need. That evening, while Natasha was at another mysterious dinner meeting, Vincent made the calls that would determine his fate. Elizabeth Stone listened to the recording with professional satisfaction, immediately recognizing its value as evidence of fraud and exploitation. This is exactly what we needed, she said. Rodriguez just handed us proof that this isn't about medical necessity, it's about financial control. I'm filing emergency motions tonight to stop Friday's evaluation and freeze all your assets until we can get a proper hearing. Vincent stared at his phone after the call ended, understanding that he had just declared war on people who had already proven they would stop at nothing to destroy him, and Friday's evaluation was still less than 24 hours away. Vincent's bedside clock showed 11 p.m. when he made the calculation that changed everything. In exactly 15 hours, Dr. Patricia Wells would arrive to conduct the psychological evaluation that would determine whether he kept his freedom or disappeared into a psychiatric facility forever. The tick-tock pressure had become unbearable, each passing minute bringing him closer to a fate that would make all of Rodriguez's previous victims look fortunate by comparison. Sleep was impossible when every heartbeat counted down to either salvation or complete destruction, and Vincent spent the dark hours methodically reviewing every piece of evidence they had gathered against Natasha and her conspirator. The morning brought news that escalated the danger to levels Vincent hadn't anticipated. James Parker called at dawn with information that made Vincent's blood run cold. Rodriguez had hired private investigators to follow James, and those investigators were asking questions about Vincent's activities that suggested they knew about the counter-investigation. They're on to us, James said, his voice tight with concern. Someone saw me leaving your house yesterday, and now Rodriguez is trying to figure out what we're planning. Vincent, if they realize how much evidence we've gathered, they might accelerate their timeline or try more direct methods to eliminate the threat. Elizabeth Stone worked with the urgency of someone who understood that legal procedures moved too slowly to save Vincent's life. She had spent the night filing emergency motions with the court, seeking a temporary restraining order that would halt all financial transactions and prevent any psychiatric evaluations until a proper hearing could be held. The good news is that Judge Martinez has agreed to review our emergency petition, Elizabeth said during a hurried phone call. The bad news is that she can't see us until tomorrow morning, which means we have to survive today's evaluation and hope that our evidence is compelling enough to stop this entire conspiracy. The receipt gathering reached its crescendo as Vincent, Keisha, and James compiled every piece of damning evidence into a comprehensive file that would serve as Vincent's defense. The documentation was overwhelming in its thoroughness. High-definition footage of Natasha's affair with Rodriguez, phone records proving their year-long conspiracy, financial statements showing $15 million in unauthorized transfers, recorded confessions of Natasha admitting she had married Vincent only for his money, and laboratory reports confirming that Vincent's food had been laced with prescription sedatives. Each piece of evidence told part of a larger story of calculated betrayal and systematic theft that no reasonable judge could ignore. Vincent prepared his final gambit with the precision that had once made him Atlanta's most successful real estate developer. He invited Natasha to what he called a family meeting to discuss their future, framing it as his acceptance of the need for professional care and financial management. "I've been thinking about what Dr. Wells is going to say tomorrow," Vincent told his wife, allowing defeat to creep into his voice. "Maybe you and Rodriguez are right. Maybe I'm not capable of handling these responsibilities anymore." Natasha's eyes lit up with satisfaction, clearly believing that her psychological warfare had finally broken her husband's resistance. Rodriguez arrived for the meeting with the confidence of someone who had never failed to destroy his targets. The attorney carried a briefcase full of documents that would finalize Vincent's surrender: power of attorney papers, admission forms for the psychiatric facility, and asset transfer agreements that would complete Natasha's theft of everything Vincent had worked to build. "Vincent," Rodriguez said with practiced sympathy, "this is the right decision for everyone involved. You'll be much more comfortable when you didn't have to worry about things that have become too overwhelming for someone in your condition." The condescension in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. Keisha moved through the house like a woman on a mission, positioning hidden cameras in strategic locations throughout the living room where the confrontation would take place. Vincent had given her access codes to the security system, and she used her knowledge of the house's layout to create multiple angles that would capture every word and gesture of what was about to unfold. The cameras were motion-activated and transmitted directly to cloud storage that Rodriguez and Natasha couldn't access or destroy, ensuring that whatever happened next would be preserved as permanent evidence. Vincent began his performance with the skill of someone whose life depended on convincing his enemies that he was beaten. He slumped in his wheelchair, allowed his voice to shake with uncertainty, and expressed confusion about financial matters that he understood better than anyone in the room. "I don't know what's happening to me," he said, looking between Natasha and Rodriguez with manufactured bewilderment. "Sometimes I can't remember things that used to be so clear. Maybe you're right that I need help." Rodriguez and Natasha exchanged glances of barely concealed triumph, clearly believing that their psychological torture had achieved its intended effect. The trap was set with elegant simplicity. Vincent had created the perfect environment for Rodriguez and Natasha to reveal the full scope of their conspiracy while being recorded from multiple angles by cameras they didn't know existed. The documents were prepared, the witnesses were in position, and the timeline was accelerating toward a confrontation that would determine whether justice prevailed or whether Vincent Hayes would become another victim of a predator who had never been stopped. What Vincent hadn't anticipated was discovering that Rodriguez's operation was so extensive and so successful that it had attracted the attention of federal investigators who had been building a case against him for months. And tomorrow's showdown was about to become much larger than a simple family dispute. Vincent's living room had never felt so much like a battlefield as it did at 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon, with Natasha and Rodriguez positioned across from him like predators closing in for the kill. The hidden cameras that Keisha had strategically placed captured every angle as Vincent prepared to reveal the truth that would destroy his wife's carefully constructed lies. "Before we sign anything," Vincent said, his voice suddenly losing the confused tremor he'd been performing all week, "I think it's time we all stop pretending." The change in his tone was so dramatic that Rodriguez actually looked up from his paperwork, sensing that something fundamental had shifted in the room's dynamic. Vincent reached for his laptop and opened a video file that began streaming live to his social media accounts, where 50,000 followers would witness what happened next. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vincent said, looking directly into the camera, "my name is Vincent Hayes, and I want you to see what my wife and her attorney have been doing to me." Natasha's face went white as she realized that their private conversation was being broadcast to thousands of people in real time. The public exposure was immediate and devastating. Within minutes, comments began flooding in from viewers who couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Rodriguez scrambled to regain control of the situation, but Vincent was prepared for his response. "Vincent, you're clearly having another episode," Rodriguez said with practiced concern, turning toward the camera as if he were the reasonable party. "This is exactly the kind of erratic behavior that demonstrates why you need professional care." Vincent smiled with genuine satisfaction as he began playing the first piece of evidence, high-definition footage of Natasha kissing Rodriguez at the Virginia Highland coffee shop, time-stamped and geotagged to prove beyond doubt that their relationship was both romantic and long-standing. The confession pivot began when Vincent played Keisha's recording of Natasha, admitting she had never loved him and had married him only for his money. Rodriguez's confidence evaporated as he heard his own voice in the background discussing medication schedules and asset transfers, realizing that months of careful planning had been captured on audio that could destroy his career. "This is inadmissible," Rodriguez said desperately. But Vincent reminded him that they weren't in a courtroom. They were in the court of public opinion, and his 50,000 viewers were rendering their verdict in real time. Natasha finally broke under the pressure of watching her reputation crumble on live video. "Fine," she screamed, her composure shattering completely. "Yes, I took the money. Yes, I've been planning this for months. You want to know the truth? You're pathetic, Vincent. Even before your accident, you were boring and predictable and beneath me." Her meltdown was exactly what Vincent had hoped for, a public confession that eliminated any possibility of claiming innocence later. Rodriguez tried to calm her down, but the damage was irreversible. Natasha had just admitted to theft and fraud in front of thousands of witnesses. The sound of sirens in the distance announced the arrival of law enforcement, but not in the way Rodriguez expected. Instead of paramedics coming to sedate a mentally ill patient, FBI agents walked through Vincent's front door with arrest warrants that had been months in preparation. "David Rodriguez," said Agent Sarah Mitchell, displaying her credentials, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and racketeering." Rodriguez's face went gray as he realized that Vincent's case had triggered a much larger investigation into his systematic destruction of vulnerable wealthy men across multiple states. Vincent's final table-turn twist came as the FBI agents were reading Rodriguez his rights. "There's one more thing you should know," Vincent said, looking directly at Natasha's horrified face. "I'm not as helpless as you thought." With that, Vincent gripped the armrests of his wheelchair and slowly, deliberately, pushed himself to his feet. The movement was careful and required obvious effort, but he was undeniably standing under his own power. Natasha's mouth fell open in shock as Vincent took 3 steady steps toward her, his legs supporting his weight, despite months of her believing he was completely paralyzed. "My doctors told me 6 months ago that I could walk again with enough physical therapy," Vincent explained to his stunned audience, both in person and online. "I've been working with a private rehabilitation specialist, slowly rebuilding my strength while you two plan my destruction. Every insult, every moment of cruelty, every stolen dollar. I was recording all of it while getting stronger every day." The revelation that his disability had been partially performance art for months added another layer of deception to an already complex web of lies and counter-lies. The payoff stacking came swift and comprehensive. Rodriguez was led away in handcuffs, facing federal charges that would likely result in 15 years in federal prison, his law license permanently revoked, and his previous cases under investigation. Natasha was arrested on charges of theft, fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse, facing her own substantial prison sentence while watching her stolen $15 million frozen by court order pending restitution. Vincent's assets were fully restored with interest and penalties that actually increased his net worth beyond what it had been before the theft. Keisha received the reward that Vincent had promised, $500,000 in cash, and his full support for starting her own cleaning company, which she named Dignity Services in honor of the principle they had fought to defend. Within a year, her business was thriving with contracts throughout Atlanta's wealthiest neighborhoods, employing dozens of people who shared her commitment to treating every client with respect, regardless of their circumstances. Vincent attended the grand opening of her second location, walking proudly through the door to congratulate the woman whose courage had saved his life. 6 months later, Vincent stood in his renovated office building looking out over the Atlanta skyline from behind his desk as CEO of Hayes Real Estate Empire, stronger and more successful than he had ever been before the accident. His recovery had been remarkable, not just physically, but professionally. The publicity from his case had brought him dozens of new clients who respected his resilience and wanted to work with someone who had proven his integrity under the worst possible circumstances. He had also found love again with Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the physical therapist who had helped him regain his strength and who saw him as the complete man he had always been. Vincent realized that sometimes life has to break you completely before you discover just how strong you really are, and that the people who try to destroy you often end up revealing the very strength they were trying to eliminate.